Hello again. I'm Brian First, and you are listening to Futures Possible. I make this show in St. John's on the island of Newfoundland. My guest today is Chris Paterson, a friend and a former colleague. We work together across Newfoundland and Labrador. Our job was to help folks in small and large communities across the province figure out how to work together on some common goals. Facilitating community conversations with Chris was always fun, and I really respected his experience and the energy he brought to all those conversations. So, Chris was somebody I consulted about the idea for this podcast very early on. As you can imagine, I was looking forward to this conversation, and Chris didn't disappoint. So, this is the future Chris imagined.
Hello, my name's Chris Paterson. I am, who am I? Uh, I am a person that lives in Grates Cove, Newfoundland, which is a small community on the northernmost point of the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland, on the island of Newfoundland. I'm not originally from here. I originally grew up in California and through good fortune met a interesting, wonderful woman from Newfoundland. And make a long story short, we ended up getting married and have had a wonderful 38 years of marriage so far. And as often happens with Newfoundlanders, at one point she convinced me it would be a good idea to move back to Newfoundland, and we said we did that. So we've been living here for about 10 years now. Growing up, I've had a strong affinity for the natural world, and from the very early age sort of felt this emotional, almost spiritual connection with the natural world, and have carried that with me wherever I go, including the work I do. So even in work that doesn't specifically deal with the natural environment, I sort of always bring that sentiment in and sort of help people understand that the connections we need to build are not just with each other, but also with the places where we live, including all those natural systems upon which we, at the very least, if we want to be sort of practical about it, that we need to survive, and if we want to be something more than practical, that bring a whole lot of joy and beauty to our lives. Well, I guess a big part of who I am is I am not only a husband, but also a father. I have two daughters, one of whom is both are adults now, and one of whom has special needs, and so she is still living with us. So much of my life these days is also spent making sure that she is able to live a happy and interesting life. So even though I'm in my early 60s, I'm still a parent of sorts. And so that's always also brings an interesting sort of dynamic into who I am and what I do. You know, when our daughter, early on in her life, we were living in Vermont at the time, and we had the benefit of having a very active, strong sort of parent-to-parent network and family network. And we can still remember at one point someone referred to this concept of being a forever parent. And at the time, it didn't make a lot of sense to us. And then over the past 5 to 10 years, it really does make a lot of sense. Because, when you approach, 60 or at some point in your life where you're starting to think about, okay, I'm not going to work forever, and I'm going to, what do I want to do in my retirement? Um, for those of us who have adult children with special needs who cannot live on their own, that's just a factor that has to be built in. And for us, every single decision that we make as a family has to sort of compromise between a future that I would like to create or imagine and create, and what is going to be necessary for us as a family. And I, made a commitment long ago that family is one of the most important things. And so the idea of for our daughter, we have to have a future that involves interaction with people. She loves the social interaction. We have to have opportunities for her to engage and doing interesting things and continuing to learn. And one of the things that we've sort of discovered is that, as we debated, moving out to Grates Cove, which in some ways it feels like it's a world away. And it's probably true of any small community. There are pros and cons of having a person with special needs in a small community. Erin, we can let Erin walk out the door here and she can walk wherever she wants, assuming it's not too foggy and and we don't feel, we're not worried. And she now literally will go for walks and go drop in on people that she knows and hang out with them and, have a cup of tea with them, or in her case, probably hot chocolate. And there are activities here that she, just automatically gets involved in that, we would have to work hard to set things up in town for her to be involved in. Whereas here, it just kind of all happens because that's what people do. No, Erin's a part of the community, and the most recent thing is, I think someone is talking already about building a Christmas float, and they're engaging Erin to be part of the float. So that's great. So it's things like that that affect. I don't think we would have moved to a spot where we felt like we couldn't have had a good life for our daughter. Let's be honest, for any, that expression, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it really takes a village to raise a special needs child who's now an adult, because believe me, she gets really tired of mom and dad pretty quickly. So it's the fact that she now has a growing network of other adults, both here in this community, but also in the surrounding region, that want to do things with her it's fantastic. So 5 years is an interesting time period because, often when you think of the future and, you're looking further out, so that you can almost separate yourself from the current reality and looking out. And, next week is easy to predict because you're doing a lot of what you're doing now. So 5 years is kind of in that transition zone, to use sort of an ecological term. We live in an interesting time. The future ain't what it used to be. And that was a quote attributed to Yogi Berra. And, that's probably been true for almost every era, as people kind of look into the future and say, oh, things are different. But somehow recently feels a lot different, feels fundamentally different. And I think part of that is that the systems that we almost take for granted, that we don't give a lot of thought to, all of a sudden are now either breaking down or at least kind of being opened up to change in unpredictable ways. And when I say systems, I'm thinking about climate change and, species, being lost. So we're now looking at a future where really it's much harder to predict kind of what the natural world is going to look like that we are living in. But also governance systems, how are we going to make decisions us collectively, and who's going to be in charge and how are they going to interact, and all those sorts of things. Now feels like we're in one of those odd tipping points where it could go in a lot of different directions, and we're really just not sure what that's going to look like. Part of what I try to bring as I think about my future and the sort of the world that I am trying to partly envision and partly create, in 5 years, is this notion of resilience. And by resilience, I mean, can we increase our ability and our likelihood to not just survive, but to thrive in whatever those unpredictable futures might look like. It really depends on which day you catch me. There's certain days where I'm less optimistic about the future. And then there's some days where I continue to have a great deal of hope that human beings will be able to figure this out. In terms of the future here in Grates Cove, similarly, Newfoundland, Labrador communities in general are going to face an interesting time over the next 10 to 20 years. Small communities, aging population, hard to continue to provide services, and it's only going to get more challenging. The more things change, the stress on government and government budgets, the idea that somehow all the systems we have in place now are going to continue to be able to provide at the same level to communities that are widely distributed is hard for me to imagine. So what does the new economic model look like for small places, including Grates Cove? There's a lot of great research on the effects of climate change on the North Atlantic current. I'm forgetting the scientific name. I haven't seen anything talk about the direct impact of if the North Atlantic current collapses or changes in some ways, what are the impacts on Newfoundland? I haven't seen anything on that. But I think if you're going to adapt to some of these things, you got to start doing it now. How do we plan for resilience? In places like Grates Cove, that's always going to be a little bit of a challenge trying to figure that out. There's a recognition in a lot of places, and Grates Cove being one of them, that it's going to be really hard to survive on our own. So, if we want a local economy, then we better support local businesses. If we want to be able to have, the relationships needed to deal with the next time we have a major storm and power gets knocked out, then we better figure out ways to work together with each other. And a lot of that's been in place, in fishing communities for generations already. But as we have places like Grates Cove where we see new people coming in, then, those are new relationships. And how do you rebuild some of that? I've learned it's a really bad idea when I move to a new place to start gardening right away. I need to wait at least a year to understand that place, that climate, that the soils, what grows, what doesn't grow. And as a case in point of where I kind of temporarily lost my mind and didn't follow that that pattern. So last year was our first full year living in Grates Cove. And I kind of made an assumption about what the limiting factors were on gardening here. And so when I thought it was temperature and soil. There's not a lot of good soil here, and obviously the temperature is not brilliant. So we had some raised beds, and we positioned the raised beds in an area where was going to get a lot of sun. I gave the plants their good soil because we created it, and we put them out there and let them go. And for the little while, everything was great. And then all of a sudden, we had a big storm, and the wind came down over the hills and just battered our poor, and these, like zucchini, things that, aren't, not even corn, not even things that are growing tall, and it just sort of wiped them out. And I learned right then and there that the limiting factors here are, yeah, soil's a challenge, but again, you can create your own soil. Yeah, temperature's a challenge, but really it's warm enough here that you can grow things. The two great limiting factors here are wind. And then the other, which I hadn't even thought about until this year and talking to people, is salt spray from the sea, because then when we get storms, the waves come crash in and then you get all the sea spray coming up. And depending on where you are, you get a lot of salt on your plants. So I think, I better show some humility, because the things that I may have learned in other places don't necessarily apply here. And I need to sort of relearn kind of what makes this place work. The two big things I worry about is we're messing with systems, and by systems I mean our natural systems, our global systems, environment, ecosystems. We're messing with systems that have evolved over centuries, millennia, and they're working. And now we're changing those systems in less than 100 years. I just mentioned the word humility. I don't think we've done this with a whole lot of humility. We are messing with systems and we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. And what we know about what we're doing suggests that we're moving the systems in a way that are going to make life a lot more challenging for humans. The earth will survive, but it may not be a suitable place for human beings. So I worry about that. And I guess on a related note is this movement toward governance systems that are more authoritarian, less democratic, more protectionist. And so I worry that how you respond to these challenges is going to make it hard for a lot of people, but we have no way of predicting how this is all going to play out. And I guess, if I want to get selfish about it, for me and for our family in particular, so we have a special needs daughter who in some future worlds would be completely devalued. It's already a challenge to get people to recognize the value in our daughter, but in future worlds, she could be seen as something less than human. which makes me anxious. And both my wife and I are sort of in our 60s. And so, we're no longer in the age where we can sort of, from a financial perspective, all of a sudden adapt and do things. And so if things start to, go south and some of the economic and other governance systems, what does that mean for our ability to sustain ourselves financially and just our household and things like that? So it's those sorts of things that make, that I won't say they keep me awake at night, but I think about them. I have this sense that what's going to be even more important in our futures are the role of artists, writers, people that can help us as human beings imagine differences, imagine different futures, imagine, kind of understand sort of human condition in different ways, so that it's not all politics, it's not all science, it's not all in the headspace. It's our ability to sort of feel and, sort of imagine, because I think it's that capacity to imagine and then translate that imagination into say, all right, well, how could we move more in that direction? I think imagination is an underappreciated capacity and resource that needs to be nurtured. And right now, I worry that our imagination capacity is declining. What gives me hope is that there's a whole lot of people out there that are helping us not lose that. No, I have an effect. I have an effect on people and places I've been, but that's, one, like throwing a pebble into a big pond. So it's creating a ripple, but then there's also lots of other ripples. And eventually, after a few centimeters, that ripple goes out, it gets intersected with others. And pretty quickly, you can't quite tell, what my ripple is doing with other ripples. And that's okay. Until I come up with something better, let's think about that as the Charlie Brown future. Charlie Brown, he's a good guy. He keeps trying. Things keep going wrong, but he keeps trying. So maybe there's something to that. One thing I am trying to do. So again, much of my professional life was working with others, helping them do things. And there's sort of a safety in that, to be honest, because you're not taking personal responsibility, therefore, than what you're doing. So one of the things I've made a conscious choice to do is to do the best I can to be a role model. So not convince other people to do things, but try to live my life in a way that people might see me doing certain things, and maybe they'll wonder why, and they'll talk to me about it, and they'll ask about it, and we'll have conversations. Will they change what they do? I don't know. That's not my goal. My goal is to, again, for them to see that some things are possible that maybe they hadn't thought about before. So one thing is just trying to be a little bit more intentional about what I do, because recognizing that what I do also sends out those ripples. I like quiet time. I like to be able, one of some of my best times of my life were and still are going for long walks. But I also like engaging with people. And maybe that goes back to the idea of sort of learning. I love listening and talking with people and kind of hearing their stories and learning kind of what new things. And so that's the other thing is to just engage with people, to, build relationships, sort of honest, authentic relationships, not always loving relationships, but authentic. Like I am literally trying to understand them and respect them as for who they are. I'm not saying every person I've met in Grates Cove I want to hang out with, but I hope I get a chance to talk to most people eventually over the next 5 years here and learn a little bit about them. If that means that's building community, then maybe that's what I do.
Thank you for listening. That was Chris Paterson and his Charlie Brown future. I'm Brian First, and you listened to Futures Possible. I talk with my guests about their futures and a way of being they can imagine for themselves in these uncertain times. You can find Futures Possible wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to leave a comment or support the show, visit futurespossible.com. If you like the show, the best way to support it is to share it with your friends and family. Take care.